Newt Gingrich, welcome. You know, we've known each other for about 40 years. We first met in the 1980s at a Heritage Foundation weekend. And since then, you've had an extraordinarily crowded and varied life, which you're still plainly enjoying. In that time, here's a few biographical notes. You were a 10 times Republican congressman. You were a history lecturer and a history buff. You've been a novelist, a historical novelist, and the writer of thrillers. Your latest thriller, Shakedown, is just about to be published. You are the CEO of a company, Gingrich 360 Degrees, which advances, consults with corporations in advancing and in amplifying and in extending American values. You're the husband and consort of an American ambassador to the Vatican. And I would have to say that throughout this varied career, you obviously had what seems to most people a high spot. You led the Republican congressman in the House of Representatives to a victory in the 1994 elections. And as a result, that became a Republican House for the first time in 40 years. You became Speaker, and you pushed through what became known as the Republican Revolution. My first question to you is this. You've gone on to do many other things. So what do you see as the main purpose of your life?
First of all, that's a big buildup. It almost made me tired thinking about how many things I've done. I think my job is to be a citizen, and I try to get up every day and do what I think citizens ought to do. And I probably have some unique background to do that because of the different things I've done in my career. But I find life every day fascinating. Right now we're in Rome, and we just finished 10 weeks of a lockdown and have now begun to unlock. And that whole experience itself was fascinating. So I really enjoy life. I'm fascinated by nature. I wanted to be a paleontologist or a zoo director. And so everything from military history to politics to how you solve problems. I love solving problems, and I love being an active citizen of a remarkable republic.
Well, I'll narrow the question then, since that was an impermissibly broad one, and say that you've generally been regarded, I think, as a fairly hard-edged partisan conservative. But when I reviewed a book of yours, I said you were unusual for a conservative in being a techno-optimist. How do you reconcile those two identities, and how do you find yourself politically?
Well, I don't know. Michael Barone once said that I was an American Gaullist, that I had the Gaul sense of nationalism combined with his sense of the importance of technology and the degree to which he thought France's future had to be technological. I think there's probably some truth to that. I grew up in the late 50s in a period where Sputnik and going to the moon and all those things were remarkable. And I think that from my standpoint, I really do believe that science and technology create better futures on balance. And that, for example, I'm very confident that we will defeat the current virus and that a few years from now it'll be an irrelevancy. And that's just the sheer power of what we're doing.
Well, as a matter of fact, the status of science is a somewhat weakened one at the moment, isn't it? We've been listening to the scientists on all of this, and I think I agree with you that we will eventually defeat it. But they do seem, they have revealed what I suppose everybody knew if they thought about it, that science doesn't speak with a single voice, that there are always disputes and different points of view. And have we perhaps not taken that into account in the early days of dealing with the virus in the way we should have done?
Well, I think it's important to understand what scientists can and can't do. When I read that 11,000 scientists have signed a petition about X, that's political science. That's not science. The fact is that Einstein once said that had he actually been able to get a job teaching, he could never have developed the theory of relativity because the social pressure of his peers would have blocked him from thinking that radically. And so I think science is about the discovery of revealed truth about nature and the natural world. And that keeps changing and evolving all the time. Second, scientists aren't politicians. There's a huge difference. It's the job of the politician to take into account an extraordinary range of variables and then to basically exercise judgment, recognizing that every one of the different variables is itself something that is an art form, not a science. And it's been fascinating to me. I do think that, and I wrote a column about this after watching what Italy went through. When you're in the early stages of a totally unknown pandemic, I think it makes some sense to try to lock down everything and try to minimize. And I think the places that did a bad job of it, such as New York, where they never closed the subways. In fact, they didn't even start cleaning the subways until 2 months into the pandemic. But on the other hand, once you have a grip on it, you ought to reopen as rapidly as possible. So it's one thing to say we need a 2-week halt to figure out what we're doing. It's another thing to say, why don't we do this for 6 months, which will just shatter social relationships and economic relationships and actually kill more people than the virus will. And that's where a scientist who's using a single focus only aimed at dealing with an epidemic may not looking at all the other variables that you ought to take into account.
That leads me to ask whether or not, since you're living in Europe, you think any European country has in fact handled the virus particularly well, handled the epidemic particularly well, and in a way that other countries, particularly the United States, might want to examine and perhaps imitate.
Well, the Germans, partly because of their culture, were able to get people to self-discipline with astonishing speed. And I think that they've been very focused on dealing medically with the problems as they arose, and they've had a pretty good track record. The Swedes had a totally different approach, but it might require being Swedish. About 50% of all Swedes live alone. And so the Swedes had a terrible record with senior citizens because much like Governor Cuomo in New York, they allowed the virus to get into the nursing homes where it killed a very large, substantial number of people. But when you look at younger Swedes, they've gone through a process of dealing with the virus at relatively low disruption to the society at large and to the economy. Those are probably the two best countries, although I'm told, and I don't have any real information, but I'm told that the Greeks actually were remarkably good at responding very, very early. And Greece has already announced that they will be open, I think, by July 1st for tourism with no quarantine. And so I think they think that they've begun to get a grip on this.
Even about 50 years ago, the churches would have played a much bigger role, wouldn't they, in dealing with the pandemic? There would have been people would have been attending religious services in large numbers. It seems on this occasion that religion has taken a very back seat, and I wonder, perhaps for good reasons, but nonetheless, it seems to have played, in Europe at least, almost no part in dealing with the virus. I wonder if you think that's going to have a bad impact on religion in general when this crisis is over.
Well, look, I think that the hostility of the governing class to religion in Europe is enormous. And I think much of what you're seeing is a consequence of that hostility. You have some of that in the United States. You had a governor of Minnesota who thought that abortion clinics were essential, but churches were not. Now, you can hardly be more overtly biased than that. So I think what we've seen, the modern Judaism and Christianity have been under dual assault, one from radical Islam and the other from a secular elitist. And it's a two-front war, ironically waged on the one front by a very intensely religious group, and on the other front by a very intensely anti-religious group, who actually are more sympathetic to Muslims than they are to either Christians or Jews.
I would just add the comment that some of the leading figures in the churches seem sometimes to be more like members of the ruling class you're criticizing than they are like clerics, for example, like priests and pastors. Do you detect that as an important element in church-state relations and the social influence of Christianity in Europe?
Well, look, I think until there is a sort of a great awakening, to use the American model, or the rise of Wesleyanism in the 18th century in Britain, until you have a genuinely religious impetus, the relation between senior clerics and the state are just sort of totally on the surface. So in a way, you're looking for the spirit of St. Francis of Assisi, or some other comparable spirit, motivating people, particularly young people, to decide that God matters in their life, and that this is the transformational moment. And I think in that sense, you need church leaders to actually be more religious and less worried about the secular world, and try to figure out how to communicate that transcending experience of God to everyday people. And if that happens, then everything else will follow behind.
Thank you. I'd like to come back later to US politics, but turn for the moment to European politics, where of course, you've been living in Rome for the last few years. They're currently, it seems to me at least, in great flux. There's the rise of populism. On the one hand, there's an attempt, on the other hand, by the European Commission, by Angela Merkel, by Emmanuel Macron, to try to tighten up and create a stronger and more integrated Europe, with more and more looking like an actual nation or nation state rather than a confederation of nations. How do you read politics and the EU? They've changed over the years. Have your opinions about the EU changed with them?
Well, I've been around long enough that my dad was stationed in Europe when the Treaty of Rome was signed in 1959. So I've watched a great deal of the effort to find a pan-European future, partly driven by two world wars. And I think that what you have is a remarkable split between the elites and the average person. And I think you also have gradual decay in places like Italy and Greece, because the original deal they cut with Germany was unsustainable. The Germans basically said, we'll loan you lots of money as long as you buy lots of German cars. Well, in the long run, that meant that the Germans were financing their own industry, and Germany's about 50% export in its gross domestic product. I mean, it's the most export-dependent country in the world. The challenge they've got is that you can't take a Greek or Italian culture and put it in the same box with a German culture and think that you're going to have any kind of fair competition. And historically, when they had national currencies, they compensated for that by constant devaluation. So the lira, for example, would get steadily weaker in order to offset the fact that Italian industry couldn't compete head-to-head with German industry. When you put them all into the euro together, you create basically a killing machine for the smaller countries. And it's been a hugely difficult problem. Then you have the fact that the elites have very different views. The elites believe that it's terrific to have lots and lots of immigrants. And I think if you talk to Macron about the number of no-go zones in France, he would just shrug it off. Well, if you're a normal everyday Frenchman, having parts of your country you can't go into anymore, and having the level of crime that comes out of those areas makes your life dangerous, even if it's not all that dangerous for people who have really nice villas and chateaus and can retreat to their country homes and so forth. So I think there's a real class distinction underway too. And then finally, the Eastern Europeans wanted the Western European money, but not Western European rules. And so I think there's a real tension between send me the cash and what do you mean I'm going to have to actually do what some bureaucrat in Brussels wants. And I think that the experiment is still an experiment. I don't think it's stable, and I don't think we have any idea what the next permutation will be. But my hunch is that they're going to have much slower recovery than the United States will, and that they will be much weaker economically.
Living as I do in Budapest, I sense that the people of Central Europe see the struggle between themselves and Brussels in defensive terms. They look upon the matter as defending their own sovereignty on the one hand, but also their culture and customs, and also a certain sense that their freedom of speech from the kind of politically correct codes that come out of Brussels and are expressed in the European Parliament or the European Court of Justice. What's your comment on that? Do you think that's a reasonable point of view?
Yeah, I think Brussels is essentially a bureaucracy driven by secular European values that reflect the technological class, if you will, and the professional class, and that probably regards virtually everybody in Eastern Europe as incorrigible. I mean, I think that Hillary Clinton's line would apply. They also regard most of working class France, almost all Italians, most Spaniards, and Portuguese as also incorrigible, and they can't even start thinking about the Greeks. So, I just think we have to recognize that much like in America, Washington has been an instrument for liberals to try to redesign the country. I think Brussels was an instrument for the left to try to redesign Europe.
I now want to ask you about what you think this means for American foreign policy. Let me quote you something said this week by Joseph Borrelli, the EU Foreign Affairs spokesman. Analysts have long talked about the end of an American-led system and the arrival of an Asian century. That is now happening in front of our eyes. And the pressure is for the EU to choose sides is growing. He then said, the 27-nation bloc should follow our own interests and avoid being instrumentalized by one side or the other. Now that sounds terribly like a revival of neutralism in a curious way in the politics of the new Cold War.
Well, I think that if the Chinese communist dictatorship were at all reasonable, that would be a rational strategy. The challenge of the only analog I can think of is the attitude of Wilhelmine Germany from 1880 to World War I, where it was almost impossible to deal with the Germans because they were so confident they were going to be dominant that dealing with the Germans meant doing what they wanted. And they were very clear about that. I think that you have the same thing building here. If you can stomach a totalitarian dictatorship that is clumsy and aggressive and in many ways racist, and you can accept what it's doing to the Uyghurs and what it's doing to the Tibetans, what it's about to do to Hong Kong, and you understand that when push comes to shove, that's their intent for your country, then I think neutralism is perfectly rational. Except for Finland, which was in a unique position, there were no real neutrals in Western Europe. I mean, Sweden was always armed and prepared to fight the Soviets. And I think that grudgingly, the Europeans understood that the Soviet Union was a mortal threat to their value system. Well, I think as the more they get to know the Chinese, the more they'll realize that you don't have to love Americans to decide that they're a pretty good ally if the alternative is Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party.
A friend of yours, someone who was a colleague during the period you were a Speaker of the House, said that one of your great strengths was the ability to read what the other side wanted and would try to do, ability to read their strategy. How would you, therefore, reading Chinese strategy, as you've described it, how would you respond to it?
Well, I wrote a book on this last year called Trump versus China, which came out in October. I think you crowd the Chinese with honesty, and you stay on them. And the truth is the Chinese Communist Party mishandled the virus in a way which will have killed probably 400 or 500,000 people and cost the world probably something like 10 or 12 trillion dollars. And you need to stay on that. You need to say, they ought to pay reparations. They should tell us the truth about what happened. They should open up their system so we can have people observe so it never happens again, because this is, after all, the fifth or sixth virus to come out of China, and there's no reason to believe it's the last one. Second, I think what we're doing now, and I work with a brilliant guy named Roger Robinson, who was on the Reagan National Security Team and helped design the economic plan for the Soviet Union. And he's now working diligently to strip away China's access to capital, and is having a real impact. And I think the Chinese look bigger and stronger than they are because for 30 years we've tolerated levels of behavior hoping they would then moderate. And what's happened, at least for most Americans now, is the conclusion that you have to deal with them as they are, not as you wish they were. And that means, for example, we're now starting to root out all the Chinese influence in American universities and making people report how much money they got from the Chinese. And we just went after a Harvard professor who failed to report honestly the money he was getting from China. So I think there are a lot of ways we'll be crowding them, and I think it's dangerous because I think there's a greater danger of a nuclear exchange with China than there was with Russia. And I think that the current generation of Chinese leaders are much more brittle than we think they are, and they're under much greater threat of the system that's falling apart. They still have several hundred million people living in stunning levels of poverty, and they have another probably 500 million people clinging to decent life by a narrow margin. So the potential in China for explosions is permanent, and I think unlike Western societies where we have free speech, we have demonstrations, we have elections, we have lots of ways to ventilate. They don't have many ways to ventilate.
And the Hong Kong situation suggests their response is simply to crack down harder.
Oh yeah, I mean they're basically going to destroy Hong Kong, and the challenge there is going to be if the world withdraws the financial opportunities that Hong Kong has had, then the Chinese will have gained a political victory at extraordinary economic expense, because Hong Kong has been a major source of capital for the development of modern China. And if that source dries up, this will be a very expensive victory for the Communist Party.
As a former executive editor of Radio Free Europe, I feel compelled to suggest that maybe one of the things we do is to be much stronger in using the internet to break things, to leap over the firewall into the Chinese population, to tell them what's happening and what we think.
There's a report out today that a military team has actually formally recommended that we engage in very aggressive psychological warfare on the internet.
Newt, could I just turn for our final set of questions to American politics? You are one of the leaders of the 1980s, 1990s conservative revival. And to many people now, that period of conservatism is described as having failed. People say that it created the circumstances in which large groups of American workers were neglected, that we were too concerned with free trade, not enough with the well-being of the American worker, and so on. What is your reply to that? Because it seems to be a point of view here across the spectrum, but particularly among people on the right.
Well, I think it depends on, depends on exactly what they were trying to accomplish. We had a country that was a basket case by 1980. It was economically decaying. It had a president who didn't have a clue what he was doing, who gave us a speech on the idea that all of us should accept much lower standards of living and expect to live with malaise. The Soviet Union was on offense, and we know now they saw themselves on offense. They thought the biocorrelation of forces was shifting their way, and that they thought that they would defeat the United States. We elected somebody who had a couple of basic big ideas: cut taxes, cut regulations, openly believe in the business community, relaunch the economy, defeat the Soviet Empire, which disappeared precisely 10 and a half years after he was sworn in. I would say where Reagan failed, and he says in his farewell address he failed, was in trying to win the cultural war in the American Academy. I always tell people Reagan defeated Marxism in Moscow, but lost to it at Stanford. And so, in that sense, I would say that we accomplished a great deal. And when we took over in '94, for the first time in 40 years, we had the largest capital gains tax cut in history. We had the most dramatic welfare reform leading people back to work in American history. More children left poverty as a result of that bill than any other time in American history, as people went to work, increased their wages. So I look at all that, and I would say to you that the greatest failure we had in that period was the failure to understand how deep the cultural cancer of the left was in our academic environments, and from our academic environments into our courts and into our news media, and that we're just beginning to really come to grips with. Secondly, I think it's a fair argument to say that we had and I say this in my book on Trump versus China. One of the reasons I wrote the book is I was one of the people who thought that Deng Xiaoping's concept in his southern tour in 1991-92, his concept was to open up the economy as a step towards opening up the country. And frankly, as I began doing research and digging into this more, I realized that Deng Xiaoping was one of the founders of the Chinese Communist Party in 21, spent a year at Lenin University in Moscow, was a totally committed totalitarian, insisted on killing people at Tiananmen Square. And what his argument was, we have to open up the economy so we'll be wealthy enough that we can sustain the dictatorship. Well, none of us understood that. And I think in the West, all of us had this naive idea that the Chinese would somehow, quote, mature. Now, a 5,000-year-old civilization probably doesn't mature in the way that we in the West arrogantly thought it would. And we were not prepared to deal with them as being Chinese. And I think it's fair to say that we sacrificed a lot of American jobs, both by tolerating Chinese intellectual theft of our property, which the Director of National Intelligence under Obama, not Trump, under Obama, estimated was almost $500 billion a year, and by tolerating a set of trade relationships where they kept their currency low in order to maximize exports. I think in the long run, we'll look back and think that was a bad deal. And that's part of why Trump was such a seminal figure. He's the first figure to really say, look, we're being taken to the cleaners by the Chinese. We need to stand up to them, and we need to insist on a better deal. And since we're their biggest customer, we have much more leverage than people think. And I think he's mostly been proven right.
Could I just ask here about Trump? Because I think it's fair to say that very few Europeans have any understanding of Donald Trump. To them, he's a one-off, he's a kind of a sport in biological terms, a mystery. How do you explain him to them?
I think he's a cross between, in European terms, he's a cross between Palmerston, Churchill, and Disraeli. He stands for a very powerful America. In the Palmerstonian sense, he stands for an America which cares about America. In the Churchillian sense, he has unbelievable courage and great capacity to fight, and a vision of the future. And I think part of what really irritates European elites is he tells the truth about it. I mean, the European elites have been a conspiracy against the Americans for most of the last 25 years. They have consistently failed to defend themselves. They've cut really bad deals with Russia, giving them increasing dependence on Russian natural gas. And they have consistently tried to subvert us in terms of dealing, for example, with the Iranian dictatorship. And then they get offended because we actually notice it. They're also, frankly, increasingly anti-Semitic. I think the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe is both frightening and dangerous, and is a disgrace in terms of their elites.
Do you distinguish here between Western Europeans, Central and Eastern Europeans, and I'd have to say also the Brits?
Well, I think depends on which topic you're asking about. I generally regard the the Netherlands, France, Belgium, Germany as sort of the centerpiece of what I just described. Um, but I also think that there has been a general decay because um, when you build a big enough welfare state with a slow enough economy, you can't afford to defend yourself. And so they really have relied on the United States to protect them for a very, very long time. I also think that the very structure of their psychology and the structure of their rules ultimately is about protecting existing businesses at the expense of future businesses. And in the long run, that's a formula for decay and a formula for very substantial youth unemployment, which almost all of these countries have.
Let me turn to the future of American conservatism. Obviously, there are serious splits in the Republican Party. Do you believe that there can be a reconciliation between Republican elites from the past, the new Trumpian nationalists and populists, and I suppose those conservatives who were kind of Buckley-esque conservatives, not quite therefore Republican elites only, but nonetheless a important force ideologically within the party? Can we reconcile them into some new governing coalition?
I have no idea. I think. I mean, the number one dynamic here is Trump. If Trump gets reelected, then a Republican Party will continue to grow around him, and the various elites will decide either that they can't stomach it or that they can stomach it. But it will be a distinctly Trump model. Now, when you look, for example, at the governors of Georgia and Florida, you see a Trump future. These are very smart, very aggressive, hard-edged people who are consciously trying to create very rapidly growing economies and consciously trying to overhaul their bureaucracies. I think that to the degree that Trump looks weaker, you'll see the non-Trump and anti-Trump groups, and they're not quite the same, being a little more bold. But I think it's useful to remember he is still probably, despite everything, at 88 or 90 or 92% approval among Republicans. Very, very, I mean, he has touched a nerve. I think partly his courage, partly that he tells the truth about things that we always believed but didn't have leaders with the guts to say it. Partially because he is polarized around the news media in a way which for populist Americans and working class Americans validates everything they've always thought. So if Trump can turn this into Trump versus CNN and the New York Times, he can create ultimately a natural majority. And the people who grow up under him, Kevin McCarthy as opposed to Paul Ryan, will in fact be pretty comfortable helping Trump govern. But the crisis for him is winning re-election. And I told him early on that everything was about 2020, because if they won, they were historic and changed history. And if they lost, they were simply a detour, and the left would come back and continue its march towards a totalitarian left.
A final question. You've written books about and documentaries about John Paul II and Ronald Reagan. But I would have thought the politician of that period who was in fact closest to you, or you were closest to her, was Margaret Thatcher. What's your judgment on her role in history?
Well, I don't know. I assume you're familiar with a little book by Claire Berlinski called "There Is No Alternative: Why Margaret Thatcher Matters," which I thought was the most useful insight into Thatcher's role as a historic figure. Thatcher did two things that Reagan did not do, partly because we were in different situations, but partly because Thatcher was a much more intellectual politician than Reagan was. And it'll be interesting to see in his second term if Trump can pick up on some of this, because he does it instinctively, but without her kind of highly disciplined approach. The first thing she did was she understood that Britain had to become an entrepreneurial country again. And there's a fascinating parallel between her and Netanyahu as finance minister, and the degree to which he turned Israel into an astonishing place for creating new businesses. And I think she really understood that and did everything she could to, and this partly required moving the culture, because it was really an anti-entrepreneurial culture in which the combination of the aristocracy and the anti-business left made it very challenging. And so she really accomplished a remarkable amount at making it more plausible to go out and just create businesses. And as a result, Britain is still a relatively wealthy country, which would not have been had Labour been able to really dominate, with the exception of Blair, of course, who Paul Johnson once called her adopted son, because Blair blunted most of Labour's dumbest ideas. The second thing she did, though, which I really admire, and I wish I knew how to better affect it in the United States, is she waged war on socialism. She understood that socialism at its heart is evil, and she dealt with it that way. And she created a dialogue which you could hardly imagine. And I think is both part of the polarization, but it's part of what really helped reshape a great deal of Britain. I haven't written about her, in part because I haven't really had the opportunity yet. I mean, it's one of those things where I go talk to my publishers. There are a number of, as you know, there are a number of really good books about her, and they don't get as they like my doing books on Trump because they know they sell, and publishers, as you well know, tend to be astonishingly mercantile. I mean, I could write a book on anything and get it published a little bit, but to write a book as a commercial venture requires that the publisher loves the idea and pushes the idea and what have you. And in fact, my next book this summer is going to be Trump and the American Future. I'm going to, one more round of Trumpism in me yet. But listen, it's great to see you. You are an authentically historic figure. You played a very important role in transforming Eastern Europe. You really played a large role in educating the American conservative movement. And it's hard to believe we've known each other almost 40 years now. But it's been a great run. And I look forward to someday maybe visiting you in Budapest.
Well, we'd be delighted to have you on Callisto at any time. Thank you very much for giving us the time, and thanks for such an entertaining and set of insightful arguments. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Great. All the best.